my good friend and parliamentary colleague, Sri Jairam Ramesh, with whom I have enjoyed a number of moments, light and heavy, in Parliament. It's always a pleasure to hear him. I must say, I'm profoundly impressed by your output. Every year he comes out with a new book. He did Indira Gandhi and Nature. Then he did Indira Gandhi and Huxley Entwined Lives. Then he did biography of Mephistopheles himself. and now he's come out with this tremendous book on the light of Asia. I mean, I'm astounded how he gets time both to shine in Parliament and also to do all this work. So I welcome him first of all very, very warmly to this function. There's a Geshe Mang Santen, there's a Karam Tej Singh Sarao, and listeners visible and invisible. I would like to begin by introducing our panel. Professor Geshe Mawang Samten is currently Vice Chancellor of the Central Institute of Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, Varanasi, and is instrumental in promoting Buddhist studies in India. That's a very fine institution. I remember Kapilaji used to be chairman of it for many years. Professor Samten has been on numerous academic bodies and is a member of the boards of several institutes in Canada, Thailand, France, and Austria. He has also served in the editorial board of the International Association of Tibetan Studies in Harvard. In 2008, he has been awarded Padma Shri by the President of India for his distinguished services in the field of education and literature. Welcome, Professor Samten. You're coming straight from Sarnath, I presume. You bring with it some of the ambience and some of the spiritual power of Sarnath. Now, Professor Karam Tej Singh Sarao is a former head and professor of Buddhist studies at the University of Delhi. He's been a fellow at various universities, that is Dongkok University, Changhua University of Buddhist Studies, Priya Sihanouk Raja Buddhist University, St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, University of Toronto, and Vishwa Bharati University. He has written more than 12 books based on research that's conducted in ardent ancient Indian texts and rare manuscripts. His books deal primarily with Buddhism and Pali literature, Indian philosophy, and history. Sri Jairam Ramesh is an Indian economic politician. He has had several portfolios and several ministries, including the Ministry of Environment and Forest. The erstwhile Planning Commission, Ministry of Industry, and other economic wings of the government. The Jairam Ramesh has been a columnist for Business Standard Today, Business Today, Telegraph Times, and so on. He has over 7 books to his credit. Those are the ones I was speaking about. So we have a very distinguished panel. Now, I also have something to say, but I think I'll leave that for the end. So perhaps we can start off by the author himself, Mr. Jairam Ramesh. Please tell us about how you did it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. First of all, it's a privilege, more than a delight, to take part in a discussion chaired by Dr. Karan Singh, India's preeminent scholar on every subject. Really, and he continues to be a source of great inspiration to all of us, and particularly to me. Professor Sarao, one of the most distinguished scholars of Buddhism and Buddhist history, Professor Samten, and friends. Well, this book is an unusual book It's a departure for me. I normally write on environment and I write political biographies. But this one is the biography of an epic poem that was published in 1879. The poet was Sir Edwin Arnold, and the poem was called The Light of Asia. It became a milestone in Buddhist historiography and was a sensation not only in England and Europe and America, but became a great sensation in large parts of India, large parts of Asia, including, of course, the subcontinent. This book is a two-in-one biography. It's a biography of the poem, trying to understand why the poem became so influential. And it's also the biography of the poet, Sir Edwin Arnold, who is an unusual personality, a great believer in British rule in India, an unapologetic, unabashed admirer of the British Raj, but also one of the earliest translators of the Hitopadesha, translator of the Gita Govinda, translator of the Mahabharata, the author of The Light of Asia, such a profoundly influential book on Buddhism and Buddha, and of course, the song Celestial, which was published in 1885, which is the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, which became one of the abiding texts for Mahatma Gandhi throughout his life. So Edwin Arnold was an unusual person, and therefore this book not only describes the poem, the epic poem, but also describes the author, who for 2.5 years was in India. He was principal of the Pune College, which later became the Deccan College, and a remarkable man, fluent in Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Marathi,
Cannot see.
and
There
of
you are,
course,
back.
and of course Sanskrit. So I try to understand in this book why is it that the poem became so influential and how it influenced so many Indian personalities, particularly starting with Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, Dharmanand Kosambi, and most recently, of course, in the later part of the 20th century, Dr. Ambedkar himself. Now, the reason why the book became so influential is because it focused on the humanity of the Buddha. It didn't focus on the divinity of Buddha. Buddha didn't become the Buddha by following a Buddha. Buddha didn't, claim godhood. And what the poem brings out is the ethical anchor the teachings of the Buddha provided at a time when there was growing disenchantment with the organized church, and there was growing disenchantment with the papacy and other institutions, and in parts of India when we were looking for icons, we were looking for figures whom we could claim as our own, which would give us a position of philosophical, spiritual, and cultural superiority at a time when we were politically subjugated by the British. Now, broadly speaking, this is a 40,000 line epic poem, and it takes us through the life of Siddhartha, the birth of Siddhartha, the Siddhartha becoming a prince, the search for enlightenment, Siddhartha becoming the Buddha at Bodh Gaya, and then, of course, the essence of his teachings. The great contribution that the poem made was to debunk this notion of nirvana as a nihilistic, negative concept. And Edwin Arnold in his poem brings out, in full glory, what he considers to be the essence of nirvana, which is an active search for morality and for ethics, and a very dynamic concept. In other words, be in the world but not of the world. And that's one of the reasons why I think this poem became very influential. Now, in India itself, it got translated into almost all Indian languages, 13, 14 major languages over the last 100 years. And there were two sets of people who were influenced by the poem, whom I tried to bring out in the book. One set was Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, who saw Buddha as a cultural figure, who saw Buddha as a spiritual and a cultural icon, philosophical icon. And there were others, they were in a minority, of course, but there were others like Dharmanand Kosambi, like Sri Narayana Guru, the great social reformer of Kerala, and of course, Dr. Ambedkar in the later part of the 20th century, who saw Buddha as a social reformer, as a revolutionary, as a political revolutionary. So this was a different concept. They drew a different message out of the poem, a message different from what Vivekananda and Tagore and Gandhi and Nehru had drawn. But in the translations into Malayalam, into Tamil, into Bengali, into Hindi, into Punjabi, it even got translated into Sindhi in the 1930s and the 1940s. So it's proved to be an extraordinary poem. It's not prose; it's a poem. It was published, as I said, in 1879, and it came at a time when there was a archaeological discovery of the Buddha. There was a textual discovery of the Buddha, and Edwin Arnold's poem really popularized the life of the Buddha. It didn't necessarily popularize Buddhism as a creed, but it popularized the life of the Buddha. And I think that's what made the message of the poem so very influential and so profoundly impactful. The other reason, of course, why Edwin Arnold is important, because of his links with the Mahabodhi temple at Bodh Gaya. After he wrote the poem in 1879, he went to Bodh Gaya in 1886, February of 1886, and he then started Shivite Mahants to the Mahabodhi Society, which had been started in Kolkata by the Sri Lankan scholar monk Angariga Dharmapala, who then took over the campaign. And finally, in May of 1953, the control of the Mahabodhi temple, the site of Siddhartha's enlightenment, was transferred from the Shaivite Mahants to this joint committee of the Hindus and the Buddhists, represented by members of the Mahabodhi Society. And when the transfer took place in May of 1953, verses from the Light of Asia were recited. So Bodh Gaya is a very important issue of how a dispute on a sacred place got resolved through a process of negotiations which lasted 70 years. And the roots of it, of course, lay in the publication of this poem, and subsequently Edwin Arnold's own visit to Bodh Gaya and the Mahabodhi temple, which he described as the Mecca as far as the Buddhists were concerned. So without wishing to say anything more, because time is very limited and we have very two distinguished scholars as commentators, I would just say that this is a two-in-one biography of a profoundly impactful poem that got translated into over 30 languages across the world. And it was impactful because of the subject, because there was an appetite for a figure like Buddha, not a religious figure, but a spiritual figure, an ethical figure, a person who was giving people an anchor at a time of growing religious skepticism and at a time of growing economic prosperity when people look for such anchors. So Buddhism may have disappeared from India, and of course Professor Sarao has written on this very authoritatively, but Buddha has not. Buddha is part of our day-to-day lives, and I can't think of any Indian home which does not have a painting or a little stone image of the Buddha in the bedroom or the drawing room. Jawaharlal Nehru carried in his bedroom at Timurti the statue of Buddha from Anuradhapura. And I'm sure in Dr. Karan Singh's residence also, you'll find paintings and stone carvings of Buddha, not one, but many. So Buddha is part of the Indian DNA. And a large part of our understanding of the life of the Buddha comes from Edwin Arnold's poem of 1879. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because of my lifelong fascination. I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not a scholar of Buddhism, but I have, like every Indian, captivated and enamored by the life and personality of the Buddha, which ultimately today can be traced back to this great poem that was published in 1879. So, sir, this is by way of some introductory remarks, and
Yes.
I would now hand
Thank
over
you.
to
Thank you. You have beautifully summed up the message of your book. And it is unique because I cannot think of any other book whose biography has been written except Tulsi Das's Ramcharitmanas. I remember when the 400th anniversary of Ramcharitmanas was being organized and celebrated, there were some books on that. But otherwise, I cannot think of a biography. The amount of research that Jairam has done and taken us in great detail, if I may say so, sometimes in excruciating detail into the various people who are involved at different levels. But thank you, Jairam, for those remarks. I will now request Geshe Santen from the Varanasi Institute to please let us have the benefit of his views.
Thank you very much, respected Dr. Karan Singh ji, Shri Jairam Ramesh ji, Professor K. K.T. Sarao ji, and viewer friends. First of all, I would like to congratulate and compliment Shri Jairam Ramesh ji for bringing out this and for reminding and bringing the century-old book, The Light of Asia, and in the form of a biography of this uh, the, the poem, the great celebrated poem. This poem is certainly a great kind of success in many ways, and it has been able to convey the message of the Buddha's life, as rightly Sri Jairam Rameshji said, that it really conveyed the humanism. And then also I found the teachings of the Buddha in Four Noble Truths and Eight Noble Paths are very beautifully narrated in the poem. And the the poem itself was a great success and became so popular and widely spread, almost globally. That was celebrated, and that enchanted so many people. And also we can see that the dramatization of the poem, and then operas performed, and then musics and researches done. All these things are very well researched kind of thing that Sri Jairam Rameshji has very beautifully narrated, and how it has impacted globally. And then I think the as Ramesh said that the nirvana, which was earlier regarded as a nihilism, he has mentioned in that poem, not that nirvana is the elimination of kleshas, the afflictive mind and afflictive karmas, and that is the total state of bliss and peace. And that kind of connotation and that kind of message and explanation that was brought in the Western platform made it very different in terms of the spiritual, the ultimate spiritual realization in in Buddhism. And also the Buddha highlighted the law of nature. The law of nature is not some kind of a law created by some supernatural power, but it is a law of nature that runs by itself. And so this is one of the very important the principle in Buddhist spirituality. So these are the factors that really has impacted, and as the author said, that it made impacts on various culture. It made impact on social norms. It made impact on authors and intellectuals and scientists. And and all the another reason why it had a very wide kind of impact is, as the author said, that the time of the emergence of this book, when the book was brought out, it was a time when the science was rising, and the rationality kind of approach was rising. And these are some of the many various factors that this poem appealed to scientists and general intellectuals and general public. Even though there were some scholarly works at that time in European countries, like the Max Muller and Monier William and things like that. But they were scholarly works. So therefore, this poem and the literatures, they have their own power to capture people's mind and penetrate into the normal life of people. And that is one of the reasons that the poem has its own way of appealing people. So that is the reason it became so popular, despite the fact that there were scholarly works at that time in European countries. Uh, I really appreciate Shri Ramesh's idea of highlighting and also doing research on the author, the poet itself, because by reading his uh, life and by reading his activities and his motivations, and it adds a lot of things to lot of things in understanding the poem itself. So therefore, I really appreciate that both of these are so interconnected, and Light of Asia and the Sir Edwin Arnold. These are two, very inextricably intertwined, and uh, and there is one the question that Sir Arnold has raised. Um, I would like to quote here: "The central difficulty seems how to reconcile the transcendental nature of his philosophical teaching with the practical realism of his morality. And the question which I shall like to put to a really enlightened Buddhist priest would be this: how can you harmonize Gautama's declaration that all phenomenal existence is Maya, illusory, with the value set by him upon preserving life, pursuing charity, foregoing self? The doctrine of Buddhism denies the importance of those social and civil relation which it its ethic if affirms more nobly than in almost any other culture. How can a crime be forbidden when the criminal or the victim has no real individual existence? So I thought that had he been, if Moni William or anyone would have clarified this very uh, prime and important issue in Buddhist philosophy, then he might have covered this in his poem. That is what uh, I thought that. So therefore, the many readers might also have this kind of question. So I would like to say a few words in this respect. Why, according to Buddhism, I would like to read from the Acharya Nagarjuna's work of Mul Madhyamika Karika, yeah, just the English
Put your
translation.
table.
Excuse me? For him to whom emptiness makes sense, everything makes sense. For him to whom emptiness does not make sense, nothing makes sense. Now, this is the nutshell that Acharya Master Nagarjuna has, presented. And on the basis of this, according to Buddhist philosophy, there are two truths. One is the ultimate truth, and the other is the conventional truth. So, according to the ultimate truth, from the prism of the ultimate truth, nothing exists intrinsically, objectively, but at the conventional level, we can see things, but they are simply projection of our language and thought. And so, therefore, to see things as a Maya, if one can see things as a Maya, then that one can see as it is. And that is having driven by the principle and by the thought and by the perception of ultimate reality. So, and therefore, and again, Acharya Nagarjuna says that there does not exist anything that is not dependently arisen. Therefore, there does not exist anything that is not empty. So these have the same kind of meaning, that there isn't any objectified, inherently existent object out there, but everything is designated by our thought and language. So therefore, the whole kind of the concept of samsara and liberation can be seen projected by Master Nagarjuna in his Mula Madhyamika Karika, 18 chapter, 5th verse. That I would like to just give a flavor of Nagarjuna's text. Read in Sanskrit: Karma klesha khyat mokshaha karma klesha vikalvataha te prapanchat prapanchastu shunyatayam nirudhyate. The English translation that I have provided in my Oxford University, the publication of the comment, along with the commentary and the root, it goes like this: through the elimination of the karma and affliction, there is a nirvana. The karma and afflictions come from conceptual thought. These come from mental fabrication. Fabrications cease through emptiness. So, what we see, unless and until we are able to get rid of this fabrication, we are not. We are trapped into the karma, and we are, trapped into the karma, and we won't be able to come out of the, the cyclic existence, the samsara. And in order to do that, the fabrication has to be ceased. Fabrication can be ceased through the understanding and realization of emptiness. So this is what I, in nutshell, would like to, say that this would be, in nutshell, the response to what Sir Edwin Arnold was, expecting from Moni William. So for readers, I thought that we should give a glimpse. Otherwise, this will always remain unanswered. So this is. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ramthan. Of course, Nagarjuna was perhaps the greatest scholar that we produced in the great Nalanda University. Now, Nalanda was the center of the world, of the Asian world at least, for 6 or 7 centuries. It's astounding how the teachings of the Buddha spread and went around the world, and scholars like Nagarjuna and others, they took up these points and took them to the whole of Asia and Southeast Asia. I've been to Borobudur, for example. You may have been, Jairam, in Indonesia. Magnificent structure to Buddhism. So it's really quite amazing. I have several things to say about it, but I will now ask Professor Karamte Singh Sarao to please give us a bit. Thank you, Professor Samson. That was very helpful, and it's good to know that the institute is following up on its original. I remember when it was founded, the idea was it would become a center for Buddhist studies for the whole of Asia, and I'm so glad it's continuing. Professor Sarao, for Diwali.
Thank you very much, sir. It's really a pleasure to participate in a group discussion under your chairmanship, along with Jairam Ramesh ji. I'm really very fond of him. I've read the other two books written by him recently, and my friend Geshe Santin ji. Of course, This book, let me say in the beginning, it's a masterpiece. Ramesh ji has examined the milieu in which it was written, has traced every translation, dissertation, thesis, adaptation in plays and movies. It's used by leaders, politicians, movie makers, even school children. The data collected by Jairam ji is mind-boggling. As a student of history and Buddhism, with my personal experience, I can tell you this is a mind-boggling collection of data, and it's very scholarly analysis. Very impressive. There is no doubt about it. This book was written in the light of Asia, basically for general reader. I don't think it was written for a specialist. I am familiar with most of the universities in the world where Buddhism is taught. When we talk about the biography of the Buddha, generally we do not refer to Edwin Arnold. It is more of a popular work than a specialist work. The Light of Asia actually in certain ways represents Buddha, I personally feel, in the sort of, not exactly in the correct fashion, but somewhat sort of popular fashion, considering the kind of milieu that prevailed during the Victorian period. For example, at that time, we already have, as Geshe Samtenji has said and Ramesh ji has written in the book, said, we do have quite a few original texts translated into English. For example, Beale's Abhinishkraman Sutra, the oldest biography of the Buddha, Nidan Katha, which is part of the Jatak book, was translated into English by Rice Davids and was published by the same publisher, Trubner, in 1880. And nobody noticed that book. It was hardly read or purchased by anybody. In fact, Trubner apparently got into very big financial trouble because he published books like Nidan Katha. And but this book became so very popular because, as Ramesh ji also has pointed out, it was meant for the general reader, written in very beautiful poetry, and he shows the Buddha as a human being, as compared to say a divine being. Of course, we have had not a debate. I don't think Vivekananda ji or any Besant were very happy with Abhidharma of the Buddha, where Atman and Brahman are denied. There's a very big debate. Vedantists were not really very happy with this, I think. In any case, but even Vivekananda ji compliments Sir Edwin for writing such a beautiful book. So despite better and scholarly works being available, this book becomes sort of so popular, such a masterpiece in a way. Now, I really do not have much to comment upon because Dr. Ramesh ji has written this so beautifully, except because it also is in a way the biography of Sir Edwin with the character of the person and the consequences of some of his actions that he takes that happen in and around the Mahabodhi temple, and the way he incited the Sri Lankans and Angaric Dharma. I would like to talk about that. Now, as a student of Buddhism, my understanding is that the Mahabodhi temple, it wasn't really constructed by Ashoka. Ashoka built a small Bodhighar there. But before Ashoka built the Bodhighar there, even Buddha came here. As Ramesh ji also writes in his book, the people tree has been sacred to the Indians right from prehistoric period. Indus civilization has ample evidence that of the worship of people tree. You have Ayurveda talking about so many medicinal qualities of the people tree. Books have been written on the medicinal qualities of the people tree. And the very particular the tree that became popular as Mahabodhi tree was actually being worshipped prior to the Buddha arrived here. And So it was a kind of one Chaitya or Vriksh Chaitya, and Indians were worshipped. And also we must remember that the two kind of spiritual settlements that we had in India prior to the Buddha arrives into this area are Varanasi and Gaya. Gaya and Varanasi are two tirthas already of the Indians. And the Mahabodhi temple that we have today, it falls within the Gaya Dharmkshetra. And so what I'm trying to say is, so the Indians in general, you can call them Hindus if you like, have been already worshipping this tree and this place. And then when the temple is constructed around the Gupta period, I think, around in the 4th century, the Sri Lankan king, who was a vassal to to Samudragupta, he approaches him to allocate some piece of land here for the Sri Lankan monks for their stay, a sort of dharmshala. And Samudragupta apparently gave some sort of extraterritorial right to the Sri Lankans to look after the temple and construct their dharmshala here. And the Sri Lankans now kind of become the owners of this temple, or at least they behave like that. And Geshe Samten will agree with me when you look at the, the anguish which was faced by the Tibetan monks, for example, people like Dharmsvamin. Now, Dharmsvamin, he wants to enter the temple. The Sri Lankan monk who was the in charge, he says, no, you cannot enter because you're carrying, Pragyaparamita Sutra with you, which is, is not a Buddhist book. It's written by Mara and so on and so forth. You go and dump this book in the Nilanjana River, take a shower there, bath there, and then you can come and maybe you could enter the temple. So Dharmsvamin writes that other than the Sri Lankans, other monks do not even have the right to enter the premises freely, and sleeping within the premises of the temple is impossible. So Sri Lankans have been controlling this temple. But what I am saying is that at the same time, the Hindus or so-called Hindus have been also worshipping here. The Pindadan, the 4th day ceremony of the Pindadan was being performed here even before the Buddha arrived here. And so after the Sri Lankans abandoned this place, and when the so-called Islamic invasions take place in this area, Bakhtiyar Khalji definitely attacked Nalanda and Mahabodhi temple, his soldiers, and this temple was abandoned and became derelict. And this Shaivite sannyasi comes and starts living here and looking after the temple. This is not the only example in the history of India. We have hundreds and hundreds of examples. You look at most of the caves in Maharashtra, which were shared by the Buddhists and the Jains and the Hindus. You have Sirpur, a very, very big site, which was also shared by the religions. And as Ramesh ji had said, you see the image of the Buddha in every typical Indian household. Every Hindu has it. And so, why Buddha should be denied to the Hindus, or why the access to the Mahabodhi temple should be denied to the Hindus? You look at the history of ancient India, even the left agrees that there was no state-sponsored persecution of any minority. If any individual committed any persecution or harassment of a minority community person, it was basically individual case of crime. The state never kind of thought of this. Why? Because we start thinking, when we think about Buddhism and Hinduism, Jainism, we kind of you see through the Abrahamic eyes how they define Buddhism, religion. In the case of India, the Indic religions, I don't think the dividing lines really existed between them, and they were sharing the holy space completely. So it is I'm sorry to use this word, a couple of other scholars have used this expression for Sir Edwin, this mischievous Victorian Indologist. He incites the Sri Lankans. He comes across a wonderful chela in the form of Angaric Dharampal, and these two rebel rousers, they create all the trouble. So the divisiveness that you see today in Sri Lanka is clearly credited to Angaric Dharampal and his friends. The Tamil versus the Singlas. Let me tell you this, in Sri Lanka, to be a Buddhist means to be a Singla. To be Singla means Sri Lankan. Others do not mean anything. And the credit for this kind of terrible thing that happened in Sri Lanka goes to Angaric Dharampal. He did the same thing at the Mahabodhi temple. The sannyasi, Shaivite sannyasi, Mahant, who was looking after that, there is absolutely no problem. The king of Thailand is so very happy. Prince Damrong is very happy. Burmese are very happy. in the 1880s, beginning of 1880s, they wanted to repair this temple. The Mahant was very happy, allowed the Burmese, and it was only Cunningham, Beglar, and others who intervened, and then the British government, in a way, takes over the repair work, and the temple is more or less destroyed, and it was a new construction, completely new construction. And a lot of scholars were very upset with Beglar and Cunningham and others. Now, what I'm saying is the incitement of Anagarika Dharampal, Sir Edwin was completely behind it. The kind of terrible things he says occasionally about Hinduism.
बीच में. Now again, he's gone off. I can't hear him.
Sir,
Can you all hear me?
there is a bandwidth issue at his end.
No, but he's suddenly frozen in time.
Professor Sarauji, we cannot hear you.
Sir, his internet bandwidth is an issue. You may please continue, sir.
How can he continue? We can't hear him. What do we do?
There's a
Mr.
question.
Rao? No, there are lots of questions. Okay, if you want to start the question now. How much time do
Sir,
we have?
I have a question that has come. What ignited you to write, basically what ignited you to write this book? That's one question that has come. Well, first of all, let me say that while we are waiting for Professor Sarau, let me answer this question as to what ignited me to write this book. What ignited, Professor Sarau is back. Yes.
So sorry, could I?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm so sorry.
All that you said.
So what I was saying was Ramesh ji has, I think, a bit soft on this person. Though he do time and again, but there is a bit of softness on the part of to kind of absolve him of this kind of terrible behavior. The typical Victorian ontologist who is very, very divisive. So on the one hand, he and his friends, Anagarika Dharampal, presenting Buddhism as anti-Brahman, which is not true, anti-caste, which is also not true. Buddha only redefines caste. He says karma should be responsible instead of birth. So karma should determine a person. And Buddha was a revolutionary. Buddha was a social reformer. None of that, I think, is true. And so this kind of definition of the Buddha that was presented by Edwin Arnold and his friends persists even today. So the communalization of Buddhism, the responsibility lies completely with, I think, Sir Edwin. Buddhism has been completely communalized, and taking a hint of from this person's light of Asia, then even people like Sir Dr. Ambedkar and today's neo-Buddhists, who are extremely aggressive and very communal, I must say. And the way the Mahabodhi temple, which was multivalent, multi-religious, the way it has been turned into a completely Buddhist place, then I don't understand how you could justify that every Hindu who was so affectionate with Buddha, I being a Sikh, I'm very affectionate with Buddha, though I consider myself a Hindu. I have also statues of the Buddha in every room in my house. And so why are we denied access to the Mahabodhi temple? Why through even the government of India in 2002, when it became a heritage center, a UNESCO heritage center, is completely turned into a Buddhist place. Indians, I think, share holy space. At least that is what they did till the British came and divided us. And people like Sir Edwin played a very dirty role in that kind of thing. So what I feel is this kind of thing perhaps needed to be sort of more emphasized by Ramesh ji. And I see one contemporary example of another character, another personality like Sir Edwin. It was Muhammad Iqbal. On the one hand, he was singing like "Sare Jahan se Acha Hindustan Hamara," and on the other hand, he is inviting people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah and inciting them to, ask for the creation of Pakistan. What a contradiction! What kind of behavior? And so I think Sir Edwin Arnold also had been a kind of person who is responsible to a very great extent in the kind of communal behavior at the hands of the Buddhists that takes place in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and also in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rao. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we couldn't hear you properly because something kept happening with the internet. But now you can go ahead with your answer, Ramesh.
So first, I've got two questions. I'll deal with them very briefly. The first question is, what provoked me to write this book? Basically, what ignited me to write this book was my interest in the life of the Buddha, and as I discovered the influence that this poem had on such a variety of Indian personalities like Vivekananda, like Tagore, Gandhi, and most importantly Nehru. I discovered in Nehru's Nehru's archives correspondence between him and Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill is writing to Jawaharlal Nehru in 1955. Both of them were prime ministers at that time. And Winston Churchill is telling Jawaharlal Nehru, remember the light of Asia. These were two bibliophilic prime ministers recalling books that they had read when they were very young. So, what struck me and why I wanted to write this book was simply that the breadth of the influence that this poem had across continents, across disciplines. I mean, C.V. Raman, India's first Nobel Prize winner in science, who gets the Nobel Prize in physics in 1930, goes to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize and says that I've been influenced by 3 books all my life. 2 of them were, of course, science. One was on physics, one was on geometry, and the third book was Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia, because I got to know about the Buddha through this poem. So that's really what ignited me to write this book. I wanted to understand why the poem was influential, what was it about the poem that made it such a sensation, and how it influenced so many personalities. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa would go into a trance when he would listen to Bengali translations of the Light of Asia. Incidentally, the first Indian translation of the Light of Asia into an Indian language was into Bengali by Girish Chandra Ghosh in 1885. And this had a very profound impact on Ramakrishna and later on, of course, on Vivekananda. Incidentally, Vivekananda saw the Light of Asia as a work of Vedanta. He saw Edwin Arnold, as a poem as a contribution to the popularization of Vedantic Hinduism. This was, of course, this was not the view that Tagore had. This was not the view that Nehru had, and certainly not the view that Ambedkar had. But it's certainly a view that Vivekananda and perhaps even Gandhi had. Now, the second question is that there is no detailed or lucid account of the poem. That the translation itself could have been given in the book and enriched it vastly. I think this criticism is absolutely valid. There's one chapter on the poem. It describes the poem. What the poem is, how it is structured. But I don't get into the poem per se, and that's a valid criticism. Because I don't get into an analysis or a deconstruction of the poem, because as Professor Sarao said, this was not an important poem from a scholastic point of view, or from an academic point of view, or from a scholarship point of view. But it became the defining image of the Buddha came from this poem because of the way it was written. It's 40,000 lines. It's a long poem. So if I started writing about the poem, I would get into a textual analysis of the poem, and frankly, that's not my strength. I mean, my strength is actually going into archives and doing some research and providing a historical narrative. So that criticism is very valid, that I don't deal with the poem per se. I deal with the impact of the poem. So I think the other point, the third point, has come on the shared space, and this is the point that Professor Sarao has made, and I want to address this very, very briefly, sir. That absolutely, Edwin Arnold was wrong in looking at Bodh Gaya as an exclusively Buddhist, treasure. Most sacred places in India are liminal in nature. Most sacred places draw people from different faiths. No one faith can claim monopoly on a sacred place. And by describing Bodh Gaya as the Mecca, the word he used was the Mecca for Buddhists. I mean, the word Mecca was alien to Buddhist thought. I mean, the notion that there is one sacred space, and Professor Sarao has highlighted this, and this is the question. And that's why, sir, the negotiations took 70 years on Bodh Gaya. Gandhi got involved. Rajendra Prasad was one of the key people in the negotiations. Sri Krishna Sinha, the great Sri Krishna Sinha, Bihar political leader. And it's only in 1953. And finally, the solution, sir, was a 50-50 Indian solution. 50% Hindus, 50% Buddhists. It was not a solution that Edwin Arnold liked, and certainly not Angarika Dharmapala. And I agree with Professor Sarao. Angarika Dharmapala was a very aggressive, a champion. But I would only add one thing, Professor Sarao. To Angarika Dharmapala, we owe a huge debt because of him and his efforts. The restoration and revival of Buddhist sites took place in India. First, it was Bodh Gaya, and most important contribution that Dharmapala makes is in the restoration of Sarnath. And you can see it when you go to Sarnath. All of us have been to Sarnath. So yes, Dharmapala is the father of Sinhala nationalism, and yes, unfortunately, Sri Lanka, that is Buddhist. It's racked by ethnic conflict and social violence. In many ways, Buddhism has become as divisive in Sri Lanka as Hinduism has become divisive in India, or Islam is divisive somewhere else. So I think the message I wanted to convey in this book, sir, and I will end here, the message I wanted to convey in this book, which is really Edwin Arnold's message: humanity unites, divinity divides. So we need a moratorium on divinity in India. We are a divinity surplus, humanity deficit country.
Thank you. That's well put. Let me say, Sarao said something about you felt that the book did not portray Buddha quite correctly. Could you elaborate a little on that, please?
Sir, what I was saying was that I have absolutely no dispute with Ramesh. It's a wonderful book. But there are certain issues which sort of go beyond it. For example, Buddha denies Atman and Brahman. Vedantic obviously would have difficulties with that. Vivekananda ji had difficulties with that. Now, for example, caste system, the way neo-Buddhists these days or some leaders these days keep on saying Buddha was social reformer, Buddha was a revolutionary, somebody called Buddha the first communist of the world, great equalizer, did not believe in caste, criticized the Brahmins. None of that is really true in a way. The Buddha sort of redefines caste system, of course. He, like Gandhiji, is against the discrimination, caste-based discrimination. Gandhiji also says Varnashram Dharma is perfectly all right. Buddha says more or less same thing. Buddha praises the Brahmins so much. For example, in Dhampa, there is a chapter on Brahmins. And so Buddha exactly wasn't really social. Right. But this kind of definition sort of propagated after the publication of The Light of Asia has become so favorite with the neo-Buddhists in India these days. It has totally communalized Buddhism.
Yeah. Thank you,
You see, there are two broad schools of why Siddhartha sought renunciation. One is the what all of us believe is the four sights school. He saw a cripple, he saw an old man, he saw a corpse, and he saw a monk. And he asked himself, what is the meaning of life? He gave up Yashodhara, he gave up Rahula, and started on his journey for enlightenment. This is what traditionally is the four sights school. But there is an alternative school, and this was a school, and this is I've discussed in the book. This is a school which was first popularized by Dharmanand Kosambi, the great Pali scholar, derived from the Pali texts, and this was given great currency and authenticity by Dr. Ambedkar in his book The Buddha and His Dhamma, which was published after his death, which is that Siddhartha was fed up with life because his father's tribe was fighting with his mother's tribe over control of a water resource, a common property resource. And neither of his father's clan and his mother's clan listened to him. He was anguished, he was frustrated, he was fed up, with this constant bickering between tribes and clans, and he gave up his princely existence and started, his search for enlightenment and meaning and so on. It's somewhat of a Marxist interpretation.
I've never heard of that before.
So this is Dharmanand Kosambi wrote about this in 1949, and Dr. Ambedkar writes about this in his book The Buddha and His Dhamma, and this is derived, incidentally, this is derived from certain Pali texts. So this is not an invention of Kosambi or Ambedkar, but I've highlighted that in the book just to say that there was an alternative interpretation given to Buddha and Buddha's life, and in which Sri Narayana Guru in Kerala, E.O.T. Das in Madras, Dharmanand Kosambi in Maharashtra, and ultimately, of course, Dr. Ambedkar. They were very influential. These are two separate schools, so to speak.
Yes.
But
Thank
sir,
you,
I mean,
Jairam.
I think it may not necessarily be just
May I say something?
it may not necessarily be one of them could be the cause
the other,
or
yeah.
reason, but they both can be, or even there can be more than two, because the situation of samsaric scenario that compelled him to take renunciation. So therefore we may not necessarily confine to one the reason, but we can have two, and we can have even more than that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sir,
All right. I want to say something there now.
yeah, please go ahead, sir.
No, first of all, I want to say that you've done a great service to us to force us to revisit the Light of Asia. Because this is something I read half a century ago, or even more. But reading this book has brought us back to the Light of Asia, which, as you say, is a very evocative. Can you hear me properly? Can anybody hear me properly?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you, sir.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes,
Can you all hear
you.
me? So, first of all, I must show you the little Buddha which sits on my office table. Jairam rightly said, okay, there's a Buddha in every home. So, there's a Buddha on my table also, just opposite where I sit. So, and it sits next to the Nataraja, interestingly enough, which is the great Shiva icon. So, as a good Hindu, I see no conflict between the Buddha being there and Nataraja being there. Let me say, we all have very high regard for the Buddha, but I have serious problems with Buddhism because I'm a Vedantist, and Buddhism in some ways is diametrically opposed. For example, what Professor Sarao mentioned, Vedantists are Atmavadis. We believe in the Atma, which goes from birth to birth. The Buddhists are Anatmavadis. Although I've never been able to understand, if there is no Atma, then what is it that gets reborn? And what is it ultimately that gets liberated? There must be some continuing thing, not only a bunch of karmas. There must be something at the center. At least that's what we believe. And therefore, the whole Atmavad and Anatmavad is a very major difference between Hindus. Secondly, for example, in this he says, pray not, the darkness will not brighten, ask not from the silence, for it cannot speak. Somehow, you know, the in Vedanta, the ananda that you have, Vedahamitam Purusham Mahantam Aditya Varanam Tamasam Parasa. I have seen that great being shining like a sun beyond the darkness. Because there is something there. And that is Ananda. I find that there's a lack of Ananda in Buddhism. It's very, very good socially and all, but where is the Ananda? Tejo Mayam Saguna Nirguna Madvitiyam Ananda Kandam Aparajatam Apparmeyam. So that is another point which I miss in Buddhism. But I'm not going into a comparative study of Vedanta and Buddhism. I'm simply saying that on the rereading of this book, it's been a very nice thing to be able to do. Once again, the basic differences between Vedanta and Buddhism have come out quite clearly. And of course, it's for people to decide whichever. Another point, Jairam, I'd like to make is that although Buddhism as such may have disappeared, as they say, it hasn't really, but look at the impact it has had. You remember 2500th anniversary of the Buddha, which was celebrated in 1956 when Jawaharlal Nehru was Prime Minister. And Unu came from Burma, if you remember. No, Uthant, which one is it?
Unu came and
Uthant, who is
no. Unu came and Chow Enlai also came. Unu from Burma.
also came. So,
And Chow Enlai also came.
yes. Yes. So that was a very big thing. Now, for example, you take our flag, the Dharma Chakra, the chakra inside owes, I think, a great deal to Buddhism. In the Rajya Sabha, as you see every day, Jairam, Dharma Chakra Pravartanaya,
Yes.
on top of the Deputy Vice Chair President's thing.
Yes.
That's also a Buddhist concept. And therefore, I think Buddhism has had a profound cultural impact. For example, animal sacrifice decreased substantially with the advent of Buddha. I would say that today, except for one or two places, maybe Kali Ghat and maybe one or two places in Assam, animal sacrifices disappeared. Now, that could have been, I think, the cumulative influence of Buddhism. And therefore, although Buddhism may not be here, the influence of the Buddha is all pervasive. And our regard for the Buddha as a Buddha, whether we go into this avatar theory or not, even the avatar theory shows that the Buddha was so popular and so influential that he had to be incorporated into the Hindu avataric. It's very, very important. Why was it done? It was done because Buddhism was very, very widespread. A lot of people revere the Buddha. The best way to do is to make him an avatar. So he becomes the 9th avatar in our whole list of avatars, as you know. And he said he came because Pashughatam, mainly because he wanted to stop animal sacrifice. So the fact that Buddha is incorporated into Hinduism in that sense is very significant. So I will end simply by thanking all of you, and thanking Jairam particularly for reintroducing us to one of the books we read in our youth, which influenced us so greatly, and for beautifully describing Edwin Arnold and his life. And sometimes perhaps I find he goes into a little too much detail. You know, it begins to read like a PhD thesis because he has such a extensive, not only Edwin Arnold, but Light of Asia, whoever was influenced by the Light of Asia, uski bhi kahani sunao, or whoever did the translation, uski bhi kahani sunao. Maybe, I don't know, it's not a criticism, but I felt that maybe a slimmer volume, slightly slimmer volume, leaving out some of the excruciating details could perhaps be a good idea. But that's not a criticism. I mean, that shows how good a scholar you are and that you're not prepared to cut corners. So congratulations, Jairam, on this book, which is really remarkable. Out of the 4 books I mentioned, I think this is the most remarkable because the way you've gone into this whole thing in such detail is something quite extraordinary. And I thank Professor Samten for that beautiful institute in Sarnath. And I thank Professor Sarao. They are, of course, authorities on Buddhism. I am a layman. I'm an Upanishad man. My whole philosophy revolves around Upanishads and the Vedanta, which in some ways are very different from Buddhism. But that does not, by one jot, reduce my personal regard and love and devotion to Lord Buddha. With those words, I thank you all very much. Perhaps we can bring the evening to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Namaskar. Jairam.
Thank you. Thank you. And great to see you, sir. Thank you, Professor Sarao. Thank you, Professor Sampton.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.